quick programming note before we begin. In about 15 minutes, General Amidror will have to get up and walk off stage because he has to catch a train and not because he's been fed up with my job moderating. So with that in mind, General, I'll pitch the first question to you. By a little way of context, JINSA, as part of its Benjamin Gettler annual policy trip, took a delegation of 4 retired senior U.S. admirals and generals to Egypt in the spring. General Bromberg was a member of that delegation. We met with top Egyptian decision makers, including President Sisi and the foreign and defense ministers, and had some very candid and illuminating conversations, not only about Egypt's internal challenges, but also its relationship with its neighbors, including Israel, and then also its relationship with the United States amid the uncertain future of U.S. engagement in the region, among a set of other issues. So that's just a little bit way of background of perhaps why we're having the Egypt panel. But General Amidror, I'd like to start with you. One of the things we heard about on our trip was Cairo's concerted effort this year, 2018, to increase its counterterrorism efforts in the Sinai. And I'd be very curious to get your perspective from the Israeli side of how the view in Sinai looks from Israel. Have you seen progress? Has it had an impact on Israel's southern border?
Thank you very much. And again, I apologize, but I have to catch the train to be before Shabbat, before Saturday in Israel. I want to begin with something bigger than that. And I think it's very important to understand. We have much better relations with our Sunni neighbors than we had in the whole history of Israel. But, and the but is very important, very little was changed when it is coming to the official media and the non-official media of those countries, which controlled indirectly by the government anyhow, when it is coming to the description of Israel and Jews in public. What happened here is a very interesting situation in which the leaders understand that they need Israel to survive or to achieve some of their goals, but at the same time, they are prisoners or trapped by their own propaganda for 70 years. And they cannot act against the propaganda. This is why everything is under the table. As one of my friends said, in the Middle East, under the table, it's very crowded. Because those leaders that are meeting our people behind closed doors or in the United Nations from time to time, trapped by their own propaganda, and this propaganda continue at the same time in those places. When the Saudis want to say that the Qataris are evil, what they are saying, the Qataris are cooperating with Israel. Why? Because Qatari money is going to Gaza Strip and supposed to help Israel somehow. And this is the Saudis with which we have cooperation under the table. And so on and so forth. So everything should be put in a perspective and proportion, not to lose it, because no question our security relations with those countries are much better than in the past. And Egypt is one example. We are facing the same enemy, ISIS in the Sinai, and we are doing everything that can be done together to win this war against ISIS. And the Egyptians have more success today than in the previous years. Did they finish and ISIS does not exist in the Sinai Peninsula? The answer is no. Are they doing much better than a few years ago? The answer is yes. And for us, it's very important. And this is why you are ready to take part in this game, in which in one side they don't hesitate, and we never say no when they ask our help. At the same time, the most anti-Semite program can be published or in the Egyptian TV. And if someone important in Cairo wants to stop such programs, he knows how to do it. it's not a question of capability, it's a question of will. And we have to live with these double standards, hoping that slowly, this understanding that the relations with Israel contributing to the state, not just to the leaders, will go down, but the key word is slowly. I was here in Washington almost 2 years ago in open meeting with Turki al-Faisal, who was nominated by the Saudis to be the one who can speak with Israeli generals. And he spoke with me, and he spoke with Amos Yadlin, and he spoke with Dori Gold. It's not that every member of the House is speaking with Israeli generals, but it was in the TV, in the internet, in real time, and every Saudi guy could enter, and they didn't know what I'm going to say. And the truth was said by him. He said, with your money, the Israeli money, and the Arabs, mind, we can change the Middle East. And it's well understood. He understands that by cooperating with Israel, the money that they have, the technology that they have, the know-how that they can bring to the table, in every area which is important for Saudi Arabia, or in this case for Egypt, agriculture, irrigation, health, education, whatever. So we are in a very unique situation in which the leaders understand, the military establishment cooperating in areas which are important to both sides, and at the same time, the vast majority of the people continue as in the past without any change. And this is the situation in which we have to live. It's the Middle East. You know, guys, it's everywhere. We spoke about Turkey in the morning. You know that since the Marmara, the trade with Turkey was more than tripled with Israel. So Erdogan is like the extreme Sunni Muslim Brotherhood, but trade is something else in the Middle East. You can continue. We will make money. You will make money. So, and it's not easy to explain to people who are coming from the West when accountability and openness and whatever is so clear. The Middle East is more complicated, and we have to play the game of the Middle East with tools of the Middle East, and it will be a huge mistake to play the game of the Middle East with tools of the West European and American rules. So this is the situation now in Egypt. The Egyptians are doing much better than a few years ago, but not enough. They have huge problems.
Thank you, General. And one thing we heard this morning was the panelists apologizing for being in violent agreement with one another. Hopefully that's something we might be able to avoid in this panel. But my next question is for you, Ambassador Abrams. And I'm going to use this as a way to shoehorn in Mike's question about your article on the side letter with the MOU. So Israel and Egypt are the two largest recipients of U.S. defense assistance. Egypt's defense assistance was suspended previously for its record on democracy and human rights, and just in September, the State Department agreed to restore $1.2 billion. A month before that, one of our other delegation members on the Gettler trip, Admiral Bruce Klingon, wrote an op-ed in Reuters calling for the restoration of that aid as a way to help leverage other aspects of the bilateral relationship. So, Ambassador, I believe you're on record saying that the U.S. defense assistance to Israel, to Egypt, is irrelevant for its counterterrorism fight. I believe that's a slightly dated comment. Do you believe that assessment is still true? And then also, if you'd like to respond to Mike's earlier
well, let me respond very quickly to Mike's earlier question. I think it would be a mistake for Israel to say, thanks for raising this to $3.8 billion a year over 10 years. I want it today. That, I think, is a mistake which is not going to go over in large parts of the United States. It sounds greedy. What would work, I think, is to do it programmatically. That is, for Israel to say, you know, we are supposed to get this many missiles in years 2 or 3 or 4, or the next squadron of planes, boy, we could use that now. And let me explain to you why we could use that now. That's an argument. It's operational. It's real world. It would lead, I think, Americans, people in Congress to say, well, you know, they're going to get those planes. Maybe they could get them a little bit sooner. There are production line questions, of course, but I would do it. I would do it by weapon system. I would do it by program. I wouldn't do it by dollars. Now, let me disagree a little bit with my friend.
By the way, I agree that we should not be greedy. I remember that when the new administration was elected, people say, oh, this is the time to change the MOU. Don't do it. Don't do it. We have an MOU. Don't touch it. And we have to be very careful not to push too much. You have to know what can be done and what cannot be done. I'm not familiar with this detail, so I don't have about this specific issue any remark. But we should be satisfied from what we got. By the way, I can tell you in this closed room that when we went to the first meetings with the Americans about it, very good friends here in Washington that know very well the administration told us, you don't have a chance to get even half of what you got. Look what happened to the budget of the American military forces, and you understand what you have to expect. And when Nagel went first time, I told him, if you come with more $500 million, you will get a gold medal. If you come with 0.2, you will get a bronze medal. And he come back and he said, I deserve the bronze medal. I mean, we have to understand that there are limitations, and we should not push in areas that will show us it's too greedy than we should be. I agree, more than agree with you. And now you cannot agree with me.
Okay, so let's turn to Egypt. General Amidor said, you know, you can't use West European or American standards, apply them in the Middle East, make those judgments in the Middle East. That's partly true, and I think partly not true, because we are a global power. We can't have 17 different standards. For example, I think it's wrong to say, you can put 50,000 people in prison. You can't put 50,000 people in prison.
Only 500.
Well, 500 is a lot fewer than 50,000. We have to make some of these judgments. Now, I agree with you that, you know, Sisi, could he do more on explaining to the people of Egypt that Israel, the old enemy, is now an ally against terrorism? Yeah. I'm not saying he should, you know, fall in love publicly, but he could do more. I think there's no question about that. I would say the same thing, by the way, about Jordan, where the military's intimacy is even probably greater, but you look at the opinion polls in Jordan, the hatred of Israel is very great. There is a risk if you simply refuse to make any moral or political judgments. I'm going to give you an example. We have a real problem in our relations with Saudi Arabia today, because it appears that they reached out to murder Jamal Khashoggi, an American resident, in Istanbul. We don't know the facts yet. That's the way it looks. That's really stupid. Put aside the moral judgment for a minute. Stupid, stupid, stupid in their relations with the Turks, in their relations with us. Guy lived in Washington. In their relations with the world's media. He's a journalist. He had 1 million friends. Stupid. Maybe if we'd been tougher with the Saudis on some of the other actions they took, mistakes they made, when this one arose, maybe somebody in Riyadh would have said, you know, this is a bad idea. Don't do it.
No, you say it's a good idea, but will be some consequences.
Right. Okay. I mean, it's not worth it. Cost benefit, not worth it. So there's a price to pay. I worry about, well, let me put it this way. Sisi has about 50 or 60,000 political prisoners. That's a lot of political prisoners. When I say political prisoner, Many of those people have not ever been tried or convicted for anything, and many were accused of doing things like peaceful protests that we would not consider a crime. Most recent, a woman talked about her being sexually harassed. Do you know they arrested her? They arrested her for saying untrue things about the country, defaming the state. Now, we ought to land on them for garbage like that. The reason I say that is in part, if you have a regime in Cairo that thinks it is so shaky and vulnerable that a woman who says that has to be arrested, if you have a regime in Cairo that is so shaky that it has to put 50,000 people in prison for nonviolent crimes or no crime, where, by the way, what happens in prison? They meet every jihadi, they meet the Muslim Brothers, they meet the ISIS guys, and it's the best place to recruit. So even from a narrow counterterrorism point of view, I worry about it a lot. I also worry about the stability of the regime. If they think they're that shaky, I really wonder how stable they are. We have another problem because we are the United States. And, you know, you can't be silent. The president spoke, the vice president spoke, the secretary of state spoke, for example, about Khashoggi. And we have a very long relationship with the Saudis, but you can't just be silent. I think we've been too silent on some of the abuses in Egypt. I don't see why, on the question of Israel, it's not possible to say more to Sisi. I'll give you another one, Copts, Christians in Egypt. Under Mubarak, there were lots of difficulties. For example, you want to build a new church? Forget it. You need to repair your church? Forget it. You need government permission, you're never going to get it. No change. No change. Didn't get better. Why not? When a Muslim gang beats up a Copt, says, for example, you went out with a Muslim girl, beats him up or kills him, in come the police, and what do they say to the Christians, to the Copts? We need to sit down and work this out quietly. We need to have community reconciliation. Nobody goes to jail. It's a freebie to kill a Christian. This is a, what is it, a 95% Christian country in the United States? 90%, pick your number. We seem to be afraid to say to Sisi, that's not acceptable. So I think in a lot of these cases, we ought to stand up for ourselves. We ought to stand up for our beliefs. We're not trying to overthrow the government. I think I can make a good argument in a number of these cases. We're giving them pretty good advice, and it would be smart for them to take the advice, not because we are the moral standard of the world, but because actually some of the things they're doing are stupid and are going to get them in trouble.
General Bromberg, I'd like to jump to a slightly different set of topics for you. First, and this is a two-part question. I want to address an issue that's come up repeatedly this morning, and also to reflect your expertise.
Again, I apologize, but it's not because of the general.
So it's his remarks.
His remarks, which I most didn't agree about many of them. Thank you very much for the opportunity, but the train is not waiting. I asked Michael to arrange a train which will wait a little bit.
You couldn't do it?
This is behind JINSA's capabilities.
Now, if we were in Egypt, this would be easy.
I can tell you some stories about it.
Thank you, sir.
Good to see you.
General, thank you so much. So General Bromberg, an issue that came up this morning repeatedly in several different contexts was the issue of the S-400. And given your expertise in air defense, I have both a very narrow question for you, which is, do you view Egypt's proposed acquisition of this system as problematic? But I also want to pitch you a much broader question. Given your experience in the delegation, I was wondering if you could perhaps share with the group some of your abiding impressions from Egypt's strategic role as a U.S. partner, its position in the Middle East, or anything else under the sun you thought was an important takeaway from the trip.
So first, I think With the S-400, it's becoming more and more of a major political tool of the Russians. That's how I see it. Because if you look, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, you look at where most countries are turning to for weapons procurement. They're turning to the Europeans, they're turning to the Israelis, they're turning to the U.S., they're turning to some other countries. But the Russians need cash, always. That's always the thing. But I think the countries where you hear this discussion, it's all about politics. I don't know, you hear about everything in the press with the S-400 in Turkey and the challenges that's doing for the NATO partner. What happens? This isn't the first time. There's been Chinese weapon systems that have been brought forward, but because of the alliance in NATO particularly, I know I'm getting a little off subject, but there's been challenges with bringing in non-NATO-based weapon systems into a NATO environment. So to me, I'm not overly concerned about, yes, it's a weapon system, it has capability, but what does it mean politically? What are the Russians buying? Are they buying favor? Are they giving away technologies? Are they making more cash for their own coffers? Or what are they doing with this? That's the real question that I see, not so much from a technical thing. We can get into a much different technical discussion. But everywhere where you see, and I spend a lot of time in Central Europe right now, and everywhere you see that the Russian threat growing, that's the continued question. What are they doing? What are they doing? What are they doing? But if you look around where they're selling weapons, I think you have to look at it from a political context. Is it another extension of policy from the Russians? That's what I see. Some observations of Egypt from the trip, just so you know, and these are just personal observations. Again, I don't have the experience of my colleague up here in the region from a broader policy perspective, but this is just a very short observation. First, the trip was extremely worthwhile. I was very impressed with President Sisi in our discussion, over 2 hours our discussion. And back to the general's point, he could change a lot of things, but he's balancing many, many things, as all leaders do. But he's articulate enough, I think, in the West, just again, a very short snapshot. The way he came across to the group, very articulate and very capable of maneuvering within not just the Mideast, but I think he has the capabilities to maneuver within the Western democracies. I think he's savvy enough to do that. And clearly, he was very open. And one of the comments that we heard repetitively from many of our groups that I thought was pretty telling was, we're looking for recognition of what we're doing to counter Iran and counter ISIS. So it's this discussion of, yeah, I've got my internal problems, but how are you recognizing me for what I'm doing to help you? So they're looking for some kind of uplifting in the eyes of the world. So I thought, and I heard that in more than one form. So I thought that was very important. The other thing I thought that was important that we heard in multiple places, also from the president, was the issue over water rights of the Nile River.
Yeah.
That was the first time we heard, and this is not an exact quote, but what I remember specifically was, if there's something we're going to go to war over, it's going to be water rights. I said, okay, now that's significant. That is really, because there's clearly a connection, obviously, historically to the nation of Egypt about, the Nile, obviously, but this is getting to be a bigger and bigger issue. So he's got this weighing on the other shoulder. And then the third thing I thought that was, and I had numerous observations, but the third thing I thought that was significant from my view at least, was the impact of the revolution on the economy. From you compare base, never been a robust economy, but it certainly devastated many, many things. I think we heard tourism was down 95+%. I mean, it really trashed the economy. But the tie to that was, from President Sisi and from other leaders, was, but you should look to us for as an example, because we rejected the Muslim Brotherhood. And we are the only country who's done this. We had a revolution, it didn't work very well, and we rejected this Muslim Brotherhood. So where's the recognition for what we're doing? It all kind of came back in a circle to me about that. So I think those, to me, were the top 3 things that I took away from the trip. The summary about everybody we talked to was the openness and the willingness to engage with the JINSA team. And I thought that was significant. So they appear to be doing some outreach in that regard of trying to bring that across. But to go back to the general's comments earlier, clearly there's things that Sisi could do. He's savvy enough to do it. He's articulate enough to do it. He's got it, but he's kind of managing numerous problems. And will he do it? He'll do it in his time. I see this everywhere. You know, time. And I'll go back to your comment. We see things and we put things out as Americans, but our timetables are not the same. And it's just the way it is. You know, everybody else's timetable is different. Their history and their culture is much deeper in some ways than the American culture, and they're going to go back to that. So that's just kind of a quick summary.
Thank you, General. So we had to truncate this panel slightly, but I want to be sure to leave time for Q&A. So if anyone has a question. Yes, Stuart.
It's too bad the General left. The question really should be directed to him, and that is with the relationship between Israel and Egypt and what is happening with the Sinai. Can anybody elaborate on exactly what Israel is doing for the Egyptians in the Sinai? You read about drones, but are they actually doing any bombing missions with unmarked planes or something like that? Heard something.
Well, officially they are not doing anything. Unofficially, they are doing a lot. That's not in the Egyptian press or really in any press. They're certainly giving them a lot of intel. That's for sure. I have been told that they are operating in the Sinai. That is, the Israelis are operating in the Sinai, always with the permission of the Egyptians. You know, we see what we think is a ISIS or Al-Qaeda group there. We can take care of it. There have been lots of rumors about the extent of this. I think what we can certainly say is there's more cooperation now about the Sinai than there has ever been. The beginning of it was, you know, under the withdrawal agreement, there are zones of Sinai in which the Egyptians are permitted to have this kind of equipment, this kind of equipment. The closer you get to Israel, the less. The Egyptians have come to Israel officially and said, we need to go in there. We need to have tanks in there. As far as I'm aware, every request has really been granted. And the degree of cooperation is fantastic. It is true, going back to what General Amidjor said, if you look at what Egyptians learn in their military academies, there's one enemy who they train against. It's still Israel. They're not really training against Ethiopia, you know, because of the Nile. It's still Israel. So there's a time warp here between the way they still think about this and the way they're actually acting.
That's a great comment.
I think we have time for one more question if there's anyone left. Wonderful. I guess we've solved everything. So on that
It's so
note,
good that you saw it all.
please
Thank
join
you.
me in thanking
Good
our
to see you.
panelists.
Good to see you.